two teenage girls take on the British Navy.
This would have been two young women trying to resist the British attack.
The surprising origins of a sweet success.
Food comes from plants, but doesn't come from rocks.
And the first female aviator.
It was possible she would end up over open water, which would be a death sentence.
Deep in the vaults of the world's greatest institutions lie extraordinary relics, tales of intrigue and wonder, and secrets waiting to be revealed.
These are the mysteries at the museum.
Garden City, New York. This quaint Long Island village was the taking off point for Charles Lindbergh on his historic flight across the Atlantic. Today, the town is home to an institution that honors that high-flying spirit, the Cradle of Aviation Museum. Its massive collection includes a lunar module designed for the Apollo 18 mission, a 1951 Fairchild guided missile, and a World War II-era P-47 Thunderbolt. But one aircraft here dates back to the very dawn of human flight.
It's over a century old, nearly 28 feet in width and 26 feet long. It weighs over 600 pounds. It has 3 wheels and 1 propeller, and its top speed is just 45 miles an hour.
According to historian Emily Fiegel, an aircraft like this one was flown by a bold aviator who proved that women could soar just as high as men.
This was a huge breakthrough. This was really the beginning of women in flight.
(1910) New York. In the years since the Wright brothers first took flight, the world of aviation has grown by leaps and bounds. But the field is utterly dominated by men.
Aviation was really a masculine field. Orville and Wilbur Wright were against women flying.
But one woman is determined to break through that barrier. 36-year-old reporter Harriet Quimby.
Harriet would have been considered non-traditional in a lot of ways. She was this very bold woman who wasn't afraid to break boundaries, to test limits.
Using her journalistic connections, she secures a place at a flying school. And after a grueling 3-month training course, she finally makes history.
She becomes the first licensed female pilot in America.
But despite her achievement, Quimby doesn't get the recognition she desires. So she decides to do something that will really capture the public's imagination. She'll become the first woman to fly across the English Channel. It's a treacherous undertaking.
The flight itself had a lot of peril to it. The weather was very tricky. It was not uncommon for crashes and pilot death regularly to occur. The flight had only been completed by one male pilot so far.
Yet Quimby is determined to beat the odds. So in March 1912, the young flyer sails to Europe to realize her dream. She acquires a Blériot 11 airplane, the same model on display at the Cradle of Aviation Museum. And on the mere morning of April 16th, Harriet climbs into the plane's cockpit. Moments later, she lifts off and rises to 6,000 feet. For the first few minutes, the flight goes exactly according to plan. But the blue sky soon gives way to dense clouds.
The fog is so thick she can't see anything.
The pilot knows she can't afford to get lost. If she runs out of fuel, the plane will plunge into the sea.
If she even deviated from planned course, even by just as little as 5 miles, it was possible she would end up over the open water of the North Atlantic, which would be a death sentence.
Quimby decides to descend in hopes of better visibility at a lower altitude. But as she dips the plane's nose, the aircraft's engine suddenly cuts out.
This was her greatest fear.
The plane starts to plummet towards the open ocean. All seems lost. But then Quimby hears a relieving sound. The engine rumbles back to life. The pilot steadies the aircraft. And as she focuses on the horizon, she spots Oakham's sight.
She is greeted by the glorious vision of the French coast, so she can see her goal in sight.
An ecstatic Quimby touches down on an empty stretch of French shoreline.
Harriet is the first woman to fly across the English Channel.
The brave aviator becomes a star.
America fell in love with her, and she earned herself the nickname the Bird Girl.
Sadly, her glory days are short-lived. Just 3 months later, while performing at an air show, Quimby's plane malfunctions, and she's killed in the resulting crash. But her contribution to aviation lives on.
Amelia Earhart credited Harriet Quimby with paving a path for her. Harriet Quimby wasn't afraid to show that women could not only achieve what men achieved, but they could do it better.
Today, this Blériot 11 hangs inside Long Island's Cradle of Aviation Museum. It recalls a history-making adventure and the high-flying courage of America's first female aviator. Baden, Austria. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the town's therapeutic hot springs were a favorite destination for composers Johann Strauss, Franz Schubert, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And in the heart of town stands a museum dedicated to perhaps the greatest musician of them all, Ludwig van Beethoven. It was here at the Beethoven House that the composer penned his masterpiece, Ode to Joy. Today, its collection includes his manuscripts, his piano, and even a lock of the maestro's hair. But kept in a glass case is a device that served as the heartbeat of Beethoven's work.
It's in the shape of a pyramid. It's almost 9 inches high. It's about 4 inches wide and deep. It's made of wood. And perhaps most importantly, there's a metal strip that moves backwards and forwards, and it's a kind of pendulum.
As historian Joshua Levine explains, this seemingly innocuous object set the tempo for one of the music world's biggest controversies.
It represents the mystery of the greatest composer of all time.
(1967), Reading, England. Musicologist Peter Stadlin is a Beethoven fanatic. The professor spends countless hours poring over the composer's sheet music and listening to recordings of his most famous pieces. But there's one aspect of Beethoven's work that has always perplexed him: the tempo.
The tempos Beethoven wrote down very, very quick.
In fact, many are so fast that even the best orchestras simply cannot keep up. This has forced many modern conductors to ignore the instructions Beethoven wrote on his sheet music and play his works at a far slower pace.
When people play his music, his tempos simply are not considered.
So why would Beethoven have set tempos so fast that no orchestra could play his compositions? The question has long been one of the music world's greatest mysteries. But Professor Stadlin is determined to answer it. Stadlin believes the phenomenon may have something to do with the cruel fate that famously befell the composer around his 30th birthday.
Beethoven was going deaf.
According to Stadlin, without the ability to hear as he worked on new compositions, the maestro had to rely on a metronome, just like the one on display at the Beethoven House. Its swinging pendulum would have provided a visual cue to help Beethoven judge the beat.
He needed a way to actually mark out time without being able to hear it. And this way, he could actually observe time.
Metronomes, even ones from the 18th century, are famously accurate. But Stadlin has a theory.
Perhaps his metronome wasn't working properly.
Beethoven was known to have violent temper tantrums. According to historians, he would often throw whatever was nearby to the ground. If his metronome was damaged during one of these fits of rage, it might explain his unusually fast tempos. So Stadlin heads to Austria on a quest to track down Beethoven's metronome.
He decides that Beethoven's metronome is the key to the pace that Beethoven intended his music to be played.
So what will Stadlin discover? Was the master composer's equipment faulty? Or did Beethoven have a need for speed?
Don Rev Run is headed back out on the road with his family. Rev runs around the world. New series premieres Wednesday, December 2nd on Travel Channel.
It's 1967. Musicologist Peter Stadlin is trying to solve a centuries-old mystery about his idol, the composer Ludwig van Beethoven. Many of Beethoven's scores indicate that they're to be played at breakneck tempos, but so impossibly fast that some think their markings are a mistake. But Stadlin thinks there's much more to the story, and he's on his way to Austria to prove it.
Stadlin tracks Beethoven's metronome to a collection in Baden. But once he holds it in his hands, he realizes he's right back to square one.
The trouble is, the weight isn't attached anymore, so it effectively doesn't work.
The missing component prevents Stadlin from determining how it functioned in Beethoven's day. It looks like his quest is at an end. But just when all seems lost, he makes a stunning realization. Letters in Beethoven's private collection reveal the composer had his metronome repaired on at least 2 separate occasions, making it highly unlikely that he would have been thrown off by imprecise equipment.
This shows that Beethoven knew when it was working and knew when it wasn't working. And so he had a perfectly good working metronome.
With this discovery, Stadlin can only come to one conclusion. Beethoven's fast tempos were no accident. But why would he purposely compose something that seems virtually impossible to play? The answer may lie in a key difference between how Beethoven's music was performed in the early 19th century and how it is typically presented today.
The fact is that, strange as it seems, Beethoven was writing a pace that modern musicians can't keep up with.
A modern philharmonic features at least 90 musicians, with a broad array of instruments filling the stage of a giant music hall. But performances in Beethoven's day would have been mostly undertaken by small chamber groups in more intimate settings.
When smaller ensembles play these pieces, they can achieve the pace that Beethoven always intended.
And this metronome on display at the Beethoven House in Baden, Austria, recalls a maestro's tempestuous talents and a fast-paced musical mystery. Located 25 miles southeast of Boston, Massachusetts, is the Scituate Lighthouse, built in 1811 and one of the oldest in the nation. Today, this elegant beacon is maintained by the Scituate Historical Society, an organization that also preserves such local landmarks as a 1650 gristmill, a 19th century schoolhouse, and a 1902 bell tower. But one of the Society's most prized historical relics is far smaller in size.
This is a wooden tube about 20 inches long with a series of holes along its length. If you blew into the hole and manipulated the other holes with your fingers, you'd make high-pitched, loud noises.
According to librarian Peter Drummey, this item recalls an incredible act of bravery in the face of overwhelming odds.
This object is at the heart of a story of heroism in wartime.
How did this unassuming instrument stop an entire army? 1814. Scituate, Massachusetts. The War of 1812 is raging between England and the United States. Up and down the eastern seaboard, British ships are raiding shoreline communities for supplies and terrorizing the populace, leaving small towns like Scituate on high alert.
Every town along the coast was subject to British attack. There was danger everywhere.
The task of keeping a lookout for British warships falls to local lighthouse keepers, such as Simeon Bates, a father to two young daughters, Rebecca and Abigail.
The Bates family were concerned about an attack on Scituate Harbor.
And on July 11th, their worst fear becomes a reality.
Royal Navy ships landed at Scituate.
There's little the poorly armed townspeople can do. British sailors sweep through the town, plundering all the food, goods, and supplies they can carry.
This was terrifying.
With their loot in tow, the British return to their ships and sail away. But there's no telling when they would return. Fearing another raid, an American militia is called in to protect the town.
The lighthouse itself was the highest observation place in the town, so there were troops stationed at the lighthouse, both to guard it and to observe the sea offshore.
Simeon Bates hosts the men at the Scituate Lighthouse. On their off-duty hours, the militiamen entertain the family with music.
They taught Rebecca and Abigail how to play the fife and drum, the musical instruments that soldiers use to regulate their movements on the battlefield.
Summer draws to a close peacefully. The threat of British invasion seems to have receded, and so the militiamen leave Scituate. Simeon Bates also decides to go out of town on business, leaving the lighthouse in the care of his daughters. Little does he know, the danger isn't over. On September 1st, the Bates sisters spy a disturbing sight.
Rebecca and Abigail looked out from their windows to see a large British warship.
The British will be on shore in minutes, and there's no time to warn the villagers.
There was nothing they could do. This must have been a moment of shock and horror for the Bates sisters.
It's 1814 in Scituate, Massachusetts. A British warship has snuck up on this remote New England village and is about to launch an attack. And the only people to have spotted this vessel are two teenage girls. So can these young women save their town?
Rebecca and Abigail instinctively grab what weapons they can, but they are hopelessly outnumbered.
This would have been two young women with no military training against an armed force of 50 or 60 experienced sailors and Marines.
Suddenly, Rebecca spies something that the militia left behind. A drum and this fife, now on display at the Scituate Historical Society.
Rebecca and Abigail couldn't fight like an army. What they could do is sound like an army.
The sisters grab the instruments and race down to the water. They hide out of sight of the approaching British and begin playing as loudly as they can.
They played the fife and drum as if they were leading a column of militia who were about to repel the British attack.
To Rebecca and Abigail's astonishment, their ruse works. The British, thinking the sound of music is coming from an advancing American militia, beat a hasty retreat.
This plan succeeded beyond what they could have possibly imagined.
Rebecca and Abigail Bates' bravery and quick thinking saves their small town from certain destruction.
These two young women had proved that they were as brave as any American soldiers. Scituate was never attacked again during the War of 1812.
And today, this fife at the Scituate Historical Society serves as a tribute to the remarkable sisters who became known to history as the American Army of Two. Richmond, Virginia boasts a proud legacy of preserving history throughout the ages, such as an 18th century church, a statue from the 1850s, and its colonial-era Capitol building. And offering a snapshot of life in the 1900s is the Maggie L. Walker Historic Site. On display are an array of commonplace items of the time, such as a family Bible, an oak vanity, and a coin bank. But nestled amongst these relics is one artifact that, despite its innocuous appearance, tells an epic story.
It's about 6 inches high, about 3 inches wide. It has a black plastic top, and it contains little white pills.
As author Andrew F. Smith attests, these tablets were the result of an accidental discovery, a death-defying stunt, and a battle against authority.
This substance was the forerunner of the product that we find in all of our kitchen cabinets today.
What incredible story lies behind the creation of this now ubiquitous household item? 1878, Baltimore, Maryland. Konstantin Fahlberg is an ambitious chemist at Johns Hopkins University. His latest assignment is to create a new preservative to keep foods fresh longer.
Fahlberg was a good scientist. He was curious, he was observant, and he was a dedicated and solid researcher.
The chemist is so diligent that one night at work, he completely loses track of time.
He was so engrossed in his research that he forgot to take a break for dinner.
Fahlberg rushes home to eat. But while enjoying some bread, he tastes something unexpected.
The crust was sweet. He was absolutely surprised.
As he samples different bits of food, he notices a curious pattern.
Every single one had a very sweet taste.
He realizes the sweetness isn't coming from his meal.
He concluded that there was something that he had on his hands that was creating this tremendously sweet taste.
In his haste to leave the lab earlier, Fahlberg realizes he forgot to wash his hands. Intrigued, he heads back to work to uncover the source of the sweetness. But with a number of chemical mixtures in his workplace, finding it could be impossible. So he does something unorthodox and dangerous.
Fahlberg licked every beaker and vial. He was willing to take personal risks in order to find out what had caused the sweetness.
Finally, he licks a beaker that bears the unmistakable taste he experienced earlier.
The source of the sweetness was a white powder, benzoic sulfonide.
Benzoic sulfonide is a chemical compound created from coal. Fahlberg had been working with the mineral in his efforts to develop a preservative. As the chemist analyzes the compound, he finds it has incredible properties.
It had 300 times the sweetness of table sugar.
And that's not all.
The human body doesn't metabolize it, so it gives a very sweet taste without giving any calories.
Fahlberg realizes he could market the compound as a healthy sugar substitute. In 1884, he files a patent and gives his invention a name.
He named it after a word that meant sugar and sweet. Saccharin.
But when Fahlberg tries to sell it, he hits a brick wall. The U.S. Department of Agriculture refuses to approve it.
They thought that this is not a food. I mean, food comes from animals. It doesn't come from rocks.
Fahlberg continues to campaign for saccharin without success. And in 1910, he dies, never having realized the fruits of his labor. So how does saccharin become the ubiquitous sweetener we all know today? It's 1910. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has declared that saccharin, the world's first artificial sweetener, is unfit for human consumption. In the wake of this decision, its creator and chief advocate, Konstantin Fahlberg,
dyes. So how will saccharin become a sweet success? In 1917, World War I is raging and international trade is at a standstill. Commodities, including sugar, are nearly impossible to get. But people still want something sweet to eat.
Consequently, there was a need for a sweetener, and saccharin happened to be there, low cost, easily made in the United States during the war.
The sudden shortage forces the government to reevaluate saccharin. They find that in small quantities, it's perfectly safe.
They lifted the restrictions on saccharin.
Saccharin sales take off.
Millions of Americans began to consume saccharin in a variety of different ways, with their coffee and with their tea.
Eventually, the sugar substitute is found in grocery stores and restaurants across the globe.
There are hundreds of different sweeteners in little packets in virtually every restaurant in America and in the world.
And this bottle of saccharin pills on display at the Maggie L. Walker Historic Site revives the tale of a dedicated scientist who used his taste buds to achieve sweet redemption. Charleston, South Carolina is home to the first public college, the first playhouse, and the site of the first game of golf ever played in the nation. So it's only fitting that it's also home to what's thought to be the first museum in America, the Charleston Museum. Its collection includes Civil War swords, a flintlock pistol, and American Indian arrowheads. But tucked amongst these weapons of war is one item that seems to belong in a beautiful home rather than a battlefield.
It is 4 feet long by 1.5 feet wide, with a white linen background and a very intricate meandering design that features brown trees, red flowers, and eye-catching bluebirds.
According to historian Zara Annis Hanslin, this colorful textile once belonged to an unlikely entrepreneur.
This is a story about a wild economic success that came out of one teenage girl's determination to never back down.
1739, South Carolina. This British-ruled colony specializes in the production of rice, and 17-year-old Eliza Lucas takes great pride in her family's 600-acre plantation. Although she's young, Eliza displays a stunning agricultural acumen.
Eliza obsessively loved botanical studies and gardening.
But Eliza's green thumb is about to be put to the ultimate test. Her father is summoned to serve in the army in the West Indies and leaves her in charge of the plantation. It's an unusual assignment, not only due to Eliza's age, but also because of her gender.
At the time, of course, women weren't given such massive responsibility.
Eliza's first task is to review the finances, and she makes a startling discovery. The plantation is going bankrupt. To save her family business from ruin, she needs a radical plan. And the young botanist knows that their current crop isn't the answer. With so many farms supplying rice, it's not profitable enough to pull her family out of debt. So she contacts her father with a bright idea. She has learned of a particular plant which could net them a fortune. Indigo.
Indigo is a plant that can be turned into a dye. It created this beautiful, deep, saturated blue that a lot of people found highly desirable.
But Eliza faces an uphill struggle. The only successful indigo farms are in the French West Indies, and the process of extracting the dye from the plant is heavily guarded by the French.
She knew that if she could get her own indigo production going, this could be something that would make them a lot of money.
Using her father's contacts, she acquires seeds and pursues her new venture. Within months, a vibrant full crop grows abundance. But now it's time for the hard part, turning the plants into dye. So she finds a man from the French West Indies willing to divulge his nation's process, albeit for a generous fee. His name is Nicholas Cromwell.
Nicholas Cromwell was supposed to be this sort of indigo savior who would make this beautiful blue dye.
Cromwell gets to work. But like his fellow farmers in the West Indies, he keeps the details of the process close to his chest. Eliza has little choice but to trust the dye maker's expertise.
He had successfully produced indigo before, so she thought that this experiment was going very well.
But when she checks on Cromwell's progress, Eliza is stunned. Instead of being a vibrant blue, the vat of dye is brown. The entire batch of carefully cultivated crops is ruined.
It seemed like it was a disaster. I'm sure she felt despair.
So has her dye maker made an innocent mistake? Or is there a more sinister explanation?
It's 1741 in South Carolina. Eliza Lucas is attempting to turn her father's rice plantation into an indigo farm in hopes of producing highly profitable blue dye. But when her dye maker, a man named Nicholas Cromwell, ruins the first batch, she's left to wonder, is her employee as trustworthy as he seems?
Baffled by Cromwell's failure, Eliza demands an explanation.
Cromwell told her that the weather was to blame.
Eliza is skeptical, so she decides to secretly monitor his work.
Eliza was a pretty savvy person, and she sensed that something was not right with the indigo production.
Eliza observes Cromwell's process until he adds the final ingredient, lime. She watches as the dye turns a brilliant blue color.
The right amount of lime can intensify the rich, deep blue that is what everyone loved.
But then, to her horror, Cromwell pours more and more lime into the batch, turning it a muddy brown. Eliza confronts Cromwell, and he makes a stunning admission. As a citizen of the West Indies, he only chose to work for Eliza so he could subvert her attempt to make indigo on American soil.
He sabotaged Eliza so that she would not be able to upset the French control of the indigo production.
Reeling from his deceit, Eliza resolves to make the dye herself. The tenacious teen collects what little information she can and embarks on an epic process of trial and error. In 1744, after 3 years of experimentation, her hard work finally pays off.
Eliza eventually ended up with an actual viable South Carolina indigo dye. The indigo breakthrough that Eliza had was more than enough to save her plantation.
And today, Eliza's indigo bed canopy, on display at the Charleston Museum, recalls the ambitious teenager who saved her family's plantation from ruin. Vienna, Austria. This opulent capital city is known as the City of Dreams, due to its honor as the home of the world's first psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud. And celebrating the city's spirit of innovation is the Technisches Museum. Its vast collection showcases an early model rescue chopper, a Royal train engine, and the first diesel-powered aircraft to fly across the Atlantic non-stop. But amid these mechanical marvels is a vehicle that, although it appears primitive, is perhaps the most important of them all.
It's 9.5 feet long, 5 feet wide. It's got a tiny little steering wheel at the front, and at the back, a wooden bench. And beneath the wooden bench is what appears to be an old-fashioned engine.
According to writer Duncan Smith, this strange contraption helped change the world. But what few realize is that its creator was almost forgotten.
He was a genius who should have been celebrated, but instead he was nearly erased from the history books.
1870, Vienna, Austria. On a clear day, an excited crowd gathers in front of the workshop of 39-year-old Siegfried Marcus. The Jewish inventor is known as one of the city's most creative minds.
He's credited with inventing everything from an incandescent gas lamp to electromagnetic triggers for naval mines. He's very, very active in a mind-boggling array of disciplines.
Marcus and an assistant push what looks like a wooden grocery wagon onto the street. But this wagon bears a peculiar modification. In the rear is a small gasoline-powered engine.
It must have looked very strange to the people, this little wooden handcart with the engine on the back.
The inventor climbs onto the cart. His assistant then spins one of the wheels, jump-starting the engine.
And at that moment, Marcus signals to his assistant to gingerly lower the now spinning wheels down on the pavement, and he shoots off. The crowd is aghast. It's the very first time anybody has seen a vehicle powered by gasoline.
Over the next several years, Marcus perfects his design. And in 1888, he unveils what he calls the second Marcus car, a new vehicle that can reach 5 miles per hour. Marcus is hailed for his revolutionary machine.
This one really looks more like the sort of thing we would call a car today.
The second Marcus car is also displayed in Vienna's Technisches Museum. But despite its enormous commercial potential, he never patents or mass produces his creation.
He was an inventor at heart. He wasn't a businessman. You could say it was an invention for invention's sake.
Marcus's work helps pave the way for others, such as Daimler and Ford, to manufacture and sell automobiles. In 1898, Marcus dies, and a memorial is erected to honor his incredible achievement. But then, nearly 40 years later, sweeping political change threatens to obliterate his legacy. 1938, Germany annexes Austria as part of Adolf Hitler's bid for European domination. As part of his master plan, the Nazi leader sets out to assert the so-called supremacy of the Aryan race.
And high on his list was the erasure of all artistic and scientific achievements which had been undertaken by Vienna's Jews.
And that includes Siegfried Marcus. Hitler orders that the engineer's achievements be systematically erased from the record.
He has his memorial torn down, his papers are burned.
They then edit the history books, crediting the invention of the automobile to German engineers like Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz. Finally, they head to the Technisches Museum to eradicate the last piece of the inventor's legacy, the second Marcus car.
Hitler orders his operatives to head straight for the museum with their sledgehammers and destroy the car completely. So that nothing is left. The last tangible evidence of the legacy of Siegfried Marcus will be gone forever.
19th century Vienna.
Jewish inventor Siegfried Marcus is the creator of what many consider to be the first gasoline-powered automobile.
But in 1938, as the Nazis rise to power, Hitler orders all mention of his efforts to be struck from the record. So will Marcus's genius be erased from history forever?
Staff at the Technisches Museum get word of Hitler's vile directive. Desperate to safeguard Marcus's legacy, they scramble to protect his priceless second car. And they come up with an ingenious idea.
They took the vehicle down into the basement of the museum and they concealed it behind a false wall.
The Nazis storm the building. Soldiers search high and low for the car. But they find no trace of it. As war sweeps across Europe, Marcus's pioneering vehicle remains safely out of sight. In 1950, 5 years after the end of the conflict, the second Marcus car is unearthed from the cellars of the museum, and the inventor's place in automobile history is restored.
People tend to think of names like Benz and Daimler and Henry Ford, but really the very first person to power a vehicle with a gasoline internal combustion engine was Siegfried Marcus.
Today, this car at the Technisches Museum not only honors a great inventor, but is also a reminder of a legacy almost erased from history. From a sweet success to the first female flyer, an army of two to a mysterious metronome.